start recording. And we'll put this talk up on YouTube for people who missed this, but I can make the listing, I think it's called unlisted, so I can just send people the link if they want it, but it won't be searchable. Or if you want, I can make it a public link so the search engines would return it.
Yeah, maybe I should see how I do.
Yeah. Okay, so it's 3:02, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. We got a fair number of attendees.
Okay.
We are fortunate today to have with us Dr. Deahn Donner from the U.S. Forest Service, and you can see it on her slide there, Northern Research Station in Rhinelander. She is, as the slide says, a research landscape ecologist up there, and she's a project leader. I asked her which project, and she said, that doesn't really how it works. She's sort of like the director, but they don't use that word director. So she kind of is the leader of the research program up there. She got her bachelor's degree from UW-Stevens Point in 1988 in wildlife. And I guess it's probably, the full title is probably something like wildlife biology or something like that. Or I don't know, was it just wildlife or wildlife biology or what, Deahn?
I think back then it was just wildlife, or it could have been wildlife management. I'm not really sure.
Okay, yeah. And then that was in '88. Then she worked for a few years. She said she kind of gallivanted around the country, but came back to Wisconsin and started working at the research station there in 1992, but decided eventually to pursue a master's degree also from Stevens Point, which she earned in the mid-90s, but then she kept on working and there at the research station, and eventually in the mid-2000s got a PhD from UW-Madison in 2007. She to get married and have kids. So for all those of you who might have a non-traditional career path, she's a living example. And she's going to talk to us today about Kirtland's Warbler. I don't have anything else to say other than I could just say Happy Earth Day, and this is the last of our seminars for the semester. So it's been a good semester, and thank you, Deahn, for being with us today.
Yes, thank you, Brian, very much for that introduction. I'm just going to let y'all know I'm going to go off camera right now. Sometimes I have a bandwidth issue, but I'll pop back on during some question periods. And so today, as Brian said, I'm going to talk about some of the research we've done with the Kirtland warblers, but I'm going to take a short break after that presentation about the research, and I have a few slides and a discussion about what next with the Kirtland warblers, because they were delisted in 2019. And I think sometimes it's important for managers and students to say, hey, it's great that they're off, that they're off the Endangered Species Act, but what comes next? So I've sort of broken the presentation into two sections, and I hope you enjoy that, and I hope you can stay for the whole part. And thank you for coming on a Friday afternoon. So the first part of my presentation, just quickly, a little brief natural history of the Kirtland warblers. Kirtland warblers have a very restricted range in both their breeding and their wintering grounds. They are a neotropical migrant bird, so they breed almost exclusively in northern Michigan, and then in the winter, their wintering grounds are primarily the Bahamian Islands. In both parts of their range, they use early successional habitat. In the breeding grounds in Michigan, it is usually young, dense stands of jack pine between 5 and 20 years old. And it is now often regenerated through plantations, but previously it was mostly regenerated with wildfires. In the wintering grounds, their habitat is shrub or scrub habitats such as black torch and wild sage shrubs. And these are often found around the coastlines, surprisingly in goat farms. Goat farms have a lot of their necessary habitat down there, and also in road right-of-ways. The population has been above the recovery goal, the original recovery goal of 1,000 singing males for about 20 years now. And it is considered recovered and stable, and it was removed from federal listing in November of 2019. Prior to delisting, however, there were uncertainties that existed on how future climate conditions would influence the population. It is a species that relies on conservation actions for their viability. And so the question became, how might habitat management and the habitat they rely on change, and how does management have to adapt? So to answer this question, we worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other partners to consider the implications of future climate conditions through their full annual life cycle. And so we examined the effect of future climate conditions to the breeding range and also to their wintering habitats. Oops, there we go. Okay, so what I'm going to describe to you today are the results of this investigation on the risk of a changing climate on their habitat. And we're going to focus on the jack pine breeding habitat in Michigan first. The Kirtland warblers, like I said, breeds only in young jack pine habitat. And the major question that they had, or that managers had, was, well, how much of this habitat might be on the landscape, and then the distribution of that jack pine on the landscape under future conditions. And then secondarily, how would jack pine growth change? Growth is an important determinant of Kirtland warblers' duration of use. So past research has shown in that middle curve there that they begin to occupy the jack pine at around 3, 4, 5 years old, and the density increases, and it plateaus around 12 to 15 years old, and then it starts to decline quite rapidly. So when you're thinking about this as a manager, you have to take in that temporal shift of how they're using a stand, and we call that a duration of use. So if growth of jack pine, and this relationship, let me back up, this relationship is based on the height of jack pine and the height of the lower live branch that you see here, over here on the right-hand side. If that bell-shaped curve gets narrow, then it means the Kirtlands are not using that habitat for nesting for as much time. If the growth slows, you might actually be able to extend the amount of time jack pine or Kirtland warblers use a stand, and you have to think about that in terms of how much habitat is on the landscape through space and time. And also from a management, how much habitat must be regenerated to sustain the targeted population size. So what we did was we developed models of jack pine occupancy and actually jack pine growth in relation to current and future temperature and precipitation scenarios using random forest. So the first thing we did was we used FIA plot data, which looks at where is jack pine on the landscape. We were just a presence and absence on our study area. Then we looked at a suite of climate and soil covariates, and then we projected those covariates, the relationship that we projected those covariates into the future, and we ended up with a distribution or occupancy maps. So then we said, okay, into the future, this is where jack pine is going to be, but then how is their growth rate going to change to different amounts of temperature and precipitation? So the next step is we then looked at where they were occupied. We again grew into FIA site tree data where we could get at their age and their height, and we looked at the relationship of their height growth again to the same climate and soil covariates, and we projected that out into the future. So we were able to get where would jack pine be on the landscape, and then how fast is it growing? And given how fast it's growing, what would that do to the duration of use and the distribution of Kirtland warblers on the landscape? So we were able to compare the resulting maps to look at this and really look to see if how jack pine is going to change on the landscape and how Kirtland warblers distribution and abundance might change in the future. And so the 11 variables that we included were based on previous research on jack pine and climate research. All of these variables, we see right here, the 5 variables in yellow were sufficient to delineate the jack pine distribution and growth, but the order changed. So the final jack pine occupancy model showed the most important variables were annual soil moisture, mean growing season precipitation. Those were the key. But in the growth or the suitability of these jack pine on the landscape, it increased in areas with a lower annual soil moisture, intermediate daily precipitation, and greater growing season precipitation, and the percent of entisol in the soils. And so jack pine growth increased in areas with greater growth season precipitation, greater annual soil moisture, and lower percent of entisol in the soil. And that then impacted the duration of use that the Kirtlands may use these stands based on how fast the jack pine are growing. I hope that makes sense. So just to compare some of our resulting maps here, you'll see the current distribution of jack pine, and then under the RCP climate models 4.5 and 8.5, you can see that there will, through under different scenarios, and we modeled this out to, I'm sorry, I should have said that earlier, to 2100. We found a contraction of jack pine within our lake states here across Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So in other words, 15% of the cells were suitable under contemporary conditions, and that encompassed 94% of the Kirtland warbler locations historically. But by 2099, only 3 to 4% of the cells were found suitable for jack pine presence. So we saw a 75% decrease in the distribution of jack pine. So that was a major loss in Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and UP, Michigan. But what was interesting is that nearly all of the areas holding Kirtland warblers today remain suitable for jack pine, with the exception of UP, Michigan. So those squares right here is where the majority of Kirtland warblers are breeding in Michigan. These other ones are outside of what is usually considered their core breeding area. And you can see by the shaded area currently, that's where jack pine is. Jack pine stayed in that area, but was much reduced in Wisconsin and up in the UP. So you have to think about the implications of that and managing into the future. So if we look at just the jack pine growth or the high suitability habitat, in those areas that are either currently jack pine or predicted to be jack pine in the future, jack pine growth varied, but it didn't vary drastically. So under future conditions, jack pine growth increased in the lower Michigan area, which potentially could shorten the duration of use of stands by the Kirtland warblers. But jack pine slowed in Wisconsin, it slowed in Wisconsin, and therefore it could actually lengthen the duration of use by Kirtland warblers. But it was really only a couple of years that we saw in the difference. So in terms of growth, we didn't see a large impact. But it was, if you put this together, what does that mean together? It means our study suggested that most of the core breeding range is going to be resilient to climate change for jack pine, but that some of the peripheral areas and the newly established populations in UP Michigan may be at risk. And so that might help with management into the future. Secondarily, the jack pine growth varied in the core breeding areas, but the duration habitat was suitable, was not projected to change substantially. And so that has a lot, so managers can look at this and kind of think about where are they going to put their efforts, and if they're going to expand Kirtland warbler breeding areas, where might they do that? And I think that the major message is they're going to be okay in the core, but we have to really think about what we need to do as managers and agencies to expand their population, which is a very it's a target that the conservation team has right now, so that you don't have one population in one core area. So that's the jack pine breeding habitat, and now I'm going to flip over to the wintering habitat quality and quantity down in the Bahamian Islands. From previous research, we know there is a link between the body condition of the Kirtlands prior to migrating and productivity and survivorship on the breeding grounds increases if they are healthy prior to migration. So in the Bahamas, Kirtland warblers feed on fruits of a variety of shrubs and arthropods that are present in that scrub open habitat that I was describing. A reduction in fruits, though, or the lowering of habitat quality through drought conditions could substantially influence the demographics and the breeding conditions. And so a lot of people don't think about that. It's not always breeding. There is a link, and that's that full life cycle and why it's so important to study a full life cycle. So in particular, in previous research, they've found that in late March, precipitation on the wintering grounds, late March is when they migrate, and the precipitation on there has an influence on the reproductive success on the breeding grounds, because March is when those fruiting bodies are on the shrub. So in drought conditions, there's not as many fruiting bodies, but with good precipitation, there's a good amount of fruiting bodies on the shrubs. And so we wanted to look at that aspect in terms of influence. In other words, if things got hotter and if there were drought conditions, what would that do to the fruiting bodies and therefore the health of Kirtlands before they migrated? The second question for their wintering habitat was the quantity. In other words, the loss of habitat from sea level rise could influence food availability, therefore increasing competition for a declining food resource. The Bahamian Islands is a low-lying island chain, and it's particularly vulnerable to land cover loss due to sea level rise. And the shrubs that the Kirtland warblers rely on, or that they use down there, often is found along the coastal edges. So that was a big question that nobody had really dealt with before. And so I just want to reiterate here, our objectives were to project the changes in Kirtland warblers' wintering habitat quality and quantity due to predicted changes in precipitation and temperature under future climate change scenarios. In the winter season, which is October to April down there, and for the the near term 2050 and the longer term 2100, as well as the habitat loss due to sea level rise within the island chain. So we focused our analysis primarily to 9 islands that have had documented use by the Kirtland warblers. Most of the records are from the central islands here of Eleuthera, Cat, San Salvador, and New Providence. And the Long Island, I'm sorry, yes. So the methods behind this, how did we do this? So for our habitat loss side of our questions, we used digital surface models. And we basically then adjusted the elevation of those. We overlaid that with open land covers or focal islands, and then we reclassified that into saying what was considered Kirtland warblers habitat. mostly on Eleuthera because we know the most about Kirtlands in that area. And we looked at that habitat loss when you adjust that, and then we looked at the percent of loss of that habitat from 1 and 2 meter sea rise. And then from the quality side of it, we looked at a baseline climate, and then we projected it out to the both high and medium and high levels of carbon dioxide. And then we used SimClimb to project the percent changes in the average winter precipitation and temperature in 2050 and 2100 relative to the baseline precipitation and temperature conditions from 1986 to 2005. And we did that to estimate the percent change that we could therefore quantify something. And the wintering grounds, I'll just say, I was really challenging because there wasn't a lot of information, land cover wise, elevation wise, for the Bahamian Islands. So that was challenging for us, but I do feel that we were able to make some good relationships based on the data that we have. So what did we find? For the land cover loss, or the loss of Kirtland warblers habitat, open habitat variable across the islands, but the greatest loss of open habitat was in the 2 northern islands. So the Grand Bahamas and the Abaca. And if you remember, those 2 islands did not, let's see, let me push this to the next. This is just an example of the Grand Bahama Islands. And this is where we had the most loss in this blue area here. However, most of that was mangroves. So it was going to have very little effect on the Kirtland warblers. And also the Kirtlands, they weren't really using these 2 islands all that much. So even though it had the greatest loss, we felt it wouldn't have that much of an impact on the Kirtland warblers now or in the near future. If you look at our central islands, which is Longcat, San Salvador, Eleuthera, where we historically have seen Kirtland warblers, 2 of the islands saw more of the habitat lost. Eleuthera, which usually has a lot of the Kirtland warblers, so that's a little alarming. Or Eleuthera that had them did not show much loss of habitat due to sea level rise. So that was a positive for us. It had very little loss compared to these northern and more northern central islands. So just so you can look at Eleuthera, this is where we have most of the Kirtland warblers out there, and the red is showing where you're having a little bit of the lost habitat. And so it wasn't that impactful. So in generally speaking then, future scenarios are showing that it's going to be wetter overall across all islands, but there are seasonal changes that exist. So in early winter, the central islands are going to get wetter than the north and north central islands up here. In midwinter, north central islands are going to be wetter compared to the other islands. And then by March, and that's the key month for Kirtland warblers' health, the central islands are going to get drier while the others are going to get wetter. And that is a little bit of concern because most of the Kirtlands right now are in this central or north central area. Under all of our scenarios, we showed that all the islands are going to get hotter. But it does not get over 28 degrees Celsius, which is the temperature threshold for many of the arthropods that the Kirtland warblers feed upon. So it really comes down to the precipitations, the precipitation changes that is going to occur in the future. So if we bring it all together for the wintering grounds, the habitat loss is going to be minimal on the north central and central islands. It's going to be mostly in the north. From a habitat quality perspective, it's going to be warmer and drier in March for those central islands, and that may influence the spatial and seasonal distribution of food resources, which may actually influence the distribution of Kirtland warblers across the islands. And so that is the greatest concern, is that change in March in precipitation. And so we felt that the conservation focus should really be, going into the future, is those north central islands, because they contain many of the wintering populations, and they're the most critical islands for any adaptation strategies that managers may want to put on the landscape in the future. But I do have to put this caveat in there that the lack of fine resolution land cover data in the Bahamian Islands was somewhat of a limiting factor for us. So it really needs to be looked at a little finer resolution than we were able to do. So climate change is predicted to have multiple effects on the breeding and wintering grounds of Kirtland warblers. Habitat loss is more of a concern on the breeding grounds, while reduced quality due to precipitations is more of a concern on the wintering grounds. And so at this point, I would just like to stop and ask if anybody has any questions about this research part of my presentation.
Yeah, people should feel free to chat in, and I see Kier raised an hand. Kier, do you want to ask the question?
Yeah.
You have audio?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
great. Yeah, so I was curious about why the Kirtlands are preferring the young jack pines, if that's known.
Well, they're ground, yeah, that's a good question. They're ground nesting birds. And so the young jack pine creates that, the lower live branches of Kirtland warblers, right? They kind of provide that protection of their nests. And they typically place their nests at the edge of open and very thick stands of jack pine. But as jack pine starts growing, right, you lose that lower live branch, and it loses that camouflage, if you would. And so at a certain height, the habitat just does not provide what the Kirtlands needs during nesting.
Thank you. Sounds good.
Then I see.
Got something going here? Let's
in
see.
The chat, yeah, look at Bob asked a question.
The chat here. Yes, there is. They are breeding in Wisconsin, Ontario, and Upper Michigan. Yes, with the population increasing the way it has, we are starting to see a lot more breeding in outside of their core breeding range. UP Michigan has done a lot of efforts to create suitable breeding habitat, and so has Ontario. So as the population has started increasing, if you will, and getting out of that core area, you're starting to see a lot more of those. So Bob, that's a really nice question, and I've always been given lots of different answers to that. And I think some of the best answers are jack pine in Canada right now is on much more fertile soil, right? So jack pine grows really fast, or faster, relatively speaking, than Upper Michigan, so it's a little bit more fertile. And also, if you were to visit some of those sites, the really extremely dry soil conditions is much more of a barren habitat in Michigan. And sometimes when you go, even in Wisconsin or UT Michigan, if you've come to some of these sites, they're similar to jack pine in Michigan, but you know, there's just a difference. So the same species are there, but you see a lot more sweet fern than you do in the breeding area. And a lot of people have suspected that it's just a climate threshold for the Kirtland warblers itself. They don't like extremely cold conditions. And your question about could they expand further into Canada with climate change. I think if you talk to the folks in Ontario, yes, they would say that, but we just didn't model that. So hopefully that answered your question, Bob.
And then I had a question about the, I'm pretty ignorant of the issues here. You had some maps showing the, you know, the maps you showed with the occupancy, I believe.
Yeah.
Of the, Wisconsin was there, and there was a little not a dense concentration. And I was trying to figure out what that was. I was wondering if it was one of the kettle moraine units or something like that. Yeah, what is that little
right
gray?
down here, actually, yeah, it's sand plains down by, oh good heavens, I'm drawing a blank right now. It's down by the Wisconsin River, and there's extensive sand plains, really dry soil, and jack pine down there, down by Black River.
Okay.
And so if you look at that area, that is still predicted to, it's very dry, very jack pine, very coniferous, lots of red pine. That's expected to stay in this area here, but it does decrease in distribution. If you know Wisconsin, up here where I have on the top here, that's the Moqua Pine Barrens section here, and the Kirtlands have been shown to occupy or nest in that area up there. But through time, the way that we modeled with our methods, that area is expected to diminish.
Yeah, I was just, the other one seemed very robust, and I was just curious what that was. And
yep.
FYI, you're using your pointer. I'm not able to see that, or we're not able to see that, I think.
Oh, sorry.
In principle, if you mouse over your slide as you're showing it, we should see your pointer, but
there we go.
No, I can see it now. Yeah, I can see it now. Yeah, great.
Yeah, sorry. So this area is those sand plains down by the Wisconsin River. Up here is where the Moqua Pine Barrens is. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And you know, we have a lot of dry areas. This is up by, if you know, not Lakewood. Land of the Lakes is up in this area. Lots of sand plains, dry jack pine here, and that is expected to diminish with our precipitation patterns. And also here, I think there's some state pine barren state natural areas up in here, and you can see some of it might still retain on the landscape, but in general, those are going to diminish, at least the way that we modeled it. So is there any other questions? So the second half of the presentation, I wanted to kind of move into what's next now that it's been delisted. And I think that sometimes that's a question that people don't ask. It's not like they get delisted and managers can then just say, hey, they're good and we don't have to do anything, especially for a conservation reliant species, which means for their continued presence on the landscape is going to take active management through time. We can't kind of just back up and hope that they're going to do okay. So I just wanted to go over and review some of during the initial listing of the Kirtland warblers, when you're listed under the Endangered Species Act, you get recovery teams. So the Kirtland warblers recovery team applied these 5 recovery strategies to try to get the population up to 1,000 breeding pairs. The first 2, the lack of suitable habitat and the high nest parasitism by the brown-headed cowbird, were the major limiting factors on the population decline. So way back in 1957, 67, the population had just plummeted. And there was only like 167 males on the landscape. And they started doing cowbird control. And that stabilized the population at around 200 pairs. But they couldn't get it to increase. And really what happened was is they didn't know enough about the habitat use and what they preferred. There was some research going on, but really what it was until 1988 was they just didn't have suitable breeding habitat out there. They didn't have the young, dense jack pine on the landscape because of wildfire suppression. So in 1980, I'm just telling you some history here. I hope it's interesting. So in 1980, I don't know if many of you heard about it, the big Mac Lake burn or wildfire occurred, and it burned, oh boy, over 10,000 hectares of jack pine that was very mature jack pine that had a lot of cones and seeds. And so when that area really took off in about 1987, 88 in terms of suitabilities for the Kirtland warblers, you saw that huge increase. It's way back at the beginning of my presentation, but you'll see the population just took off. And really the Mac Lake burn, for how devastating it was to people's property, and there was a human loss of life in there. That event with cowbirds really were the turning points for Kirtland warblers. And so, but beyond that, I went off on a tangent a little on there, but beyond that, the team also adopted annual monitoring so they could understand where the population is every year. Prior to listing, they were only doing monitoring every 10 years. But they wanted to learn more about the demographics and the habitat use because they didn't know it. And they also felt that there wasn't enough research happening, so that was a huge part of the recovery strategy originally. And also, they wanted to, which I found really interesting, is they put a lot of effort into raising the public awareness through information and education activities. And that, I think, is really interesting. And even today, every year, there is a Kirtland Warblers Festival that brings in people everywhere from around the world. And they actually also conduct tours that brings in people all over the world. So those those 5 things were key strategies in their recovery. But what's going to happen post-recovery, right? There's not as much money out there, right? And there's a lot of different changing priorities. And so the greatest threat of post-listing was the loss of these strategies that were so successful in their recovery, again, to reduce funding and changing priorities. And so before they actually delisted the species, after we looked at climate change and said, okay, they should be stable in the future, and we know how to deal with that risk, they also did not delist until they had what they felt was a working group of organizations and some MOUs to continue the conservation efforts. And because they didn't want to delist and have the Kirtland warblers relisted. And so they were one of the first actually to develop this conservation partnership. And the Kirtland Warblers conservation team now has taken over, and they coordinate much of the conservation efforts into the future. And that team there you can see is the Fish and Wildlife Service, the DNR, the US Forest Service, lots of some other nonprofits, and they've actually entered into an MOU to complete the conservation plan that's going to guide their management. And it also outlines commitments of recreating habitat and cowbird trapping into the future. So while they took over and they started writing the conservation plan, one of their first questions was, should it be the same as the 1985 recovery plan? Back there, if I show this, these were the original conditions of the early recovery plan. So about 12,000 hectares of habitat were to be regenerated annually, so that they always had a high enough enough quantity on the landscape to sustain at least 1,000 pairs of Kirtland warblers. And they put it on a 45 to 50 year commercial timber rotation. And they did that so that there was some timber value in it. But what that meant was there was more landscape that had to be managed, but not all of it was going to be suitable in any given year. And so to get what they needed based on the demographics that they knew at the time, 57,000 hectares of the land base was designated as essential habitat, and that's in all of these red areas that you see here. The orange here is the federal and the red is the state. So currently, through time, they've added acreages, right? So they're about up to 88,000 hectares. That's going to be managed not only in Lower Peninsula, Michigan, but also if you consider the UP, because of habitat regeneration have been increasing up here. But the question to the managers was, is the land base required at current densities? What is the land base that's going to be required given their current densities and to maintain their population, especially over that 1,000 breeding pairs? So it's not only the question of the land base that has to be managed, but it's also that question of higher quality nesting habitat. Wildfire regenerated habitat usually created denser stems per acre with very small openings, and that was considered their optimal habitat, and that's where Kirtland warblers had higher densities of nesting pairs. But with fire suppression, you know, they weren't able to put that on the landscape. Changing land use, the public didn't like it, etc. So through time, after the Mac Lake burn occurred in the late 80s, managers kind of changed their strategy, and they had a little bit of ability to experiment. And so what they did was create these dense plantations that tried to mimic the spatial patterns created by wildfire. And you can see the picture here of these. This is a very large, because they're an area sensitive species, very large area where they used plantations to create those dense areas, and they did opposing waves. So this would be the dense jack pines, but those opposing waves would leave those openings on the landscape. And the reason they like the landscapes is the ground nesting of Kirtlands, they like to place their nest at the edge of that. And so this has been really, really successful, and they're now able to get densities of Kirtland warblers in these plantations very similar to habitat regenerated through natural wildfire. But the future challenge is creating this breeding habitat, because even though it's been remarkably successful, it is very costly to create this habitat. Not only that, it had some other implications on the broader landscape, right? So it skewed the jack pine age class on the landscape to a very young age. And it also, there is arguments out there that it did a lot of ecosystem homogenization. And so it lost a lot of heterogeneity, because jack pine barrens is used by a lot of species, barren dependent species. Barrens is a system that's declining worldwide. And so managers were starting to say, okay, we've got the Kirtlands where we need to, maybe we need to start considering other species. And the other issue that managers, and I'll deal with this a little bit more, is the marketability of the jack pine. Jack pine was planted so thick to rapidly get Kirtland warblers in there, but it was so thick that through time, if you remember I said it would be on a 45 to 50 year rotation, they were finding that by 30 years old, the jack pine got too thick, they weren't growing, and they couldn't find anybody to actually harvest the jack pine. It became worthless. And so those are just some of those practical things that you really need to think about as a manager of bringing in the Kirtland warblers, and now what next? So to eliminate some of these issues that they were facing now, and post delisting, the managers wanted to think about this, and this is what they were trying to incorporate in their conservation plans. So how could you reduce the cost of habitat creation? And this is some of the things they were thinking about, is the density. Also, some of the things that they've had to do is site preparation, was trenching or scarification. Well, what if just seeding might work, or maybe just natural regeneration now? And so also they're finding that they had a lot of tree mortality that was happening from drought stress or disease that was requiring replanting. So these are some of the things they were thinking, okay, how are we going to do this in the future? And start looking at, do we have to trench everything? Can we go a little denser or a little less dense in our planting, so it's not going to cost us this much? And then how can we maybe reduce this replanting cost that they were always having to deal with? And they also began to start thinking about using different silvicultural systems to promote heterogeneity for other species, and bring some of that structural heterogeneity back in. So, and these are some of the species that they also rely on Barrens habitat that managers also have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And reducing the skewed age distribution. So like I said before, if this is just in the federal area, okay, so this uneven distribution over here on the left, they have a lot of 0 to 9 and 10 to 19-year-old habitat on the landscape. But they also have a lot of 30, 39-year-old from previous, from a lot of putting this habitat on the landscape previously, but they don't have a lot in the older age group. And so, they want to bring more of an even distribution across the landscape, not only for the marketability, but also for the Kirtlands and also for other species that like a little mid cereal stage of jack pine. And so what the conservation plan is now focusing on, and how they wrote their plan, was new breeding habitat. They're going to look at, among all those essential areas, 75% will be the traditional high density stocking with the opposing waves, but they're going to start integrating 25% of new habitat to be non-traditional stocking. In other words, a lower stocking rate. Non-traditional is lower stocking rate, and more open areas, and it has more of a red pine component. And they're feeling that this might increase the ecological diversity and the timber value that I was talking about, which is critical to offset the cost of replanting. But what are the trade-offs of that from Kirtland Warbler management? And the trade-offs might mean that we have to accept a lower number of birds on the landscape due to the potential lower habitat quality that's out there. Another thing that they talked a lot about is the future challenges with cowbird management. Cowbird management is very expensive, and it was very costly. Now, recent trends have shown a drastic decline in cowbirds just on the landscape, almost to the point that it's non-existent. And so they have stopped trapping, and they started reducing that in 2015. They continue to not trap. There is research going on and finding out that there is a little bit of parasitism, but not much. And so the question now for managers and researchers are, do we continue to monitor it, and what's the threshold amount of parasitism that the Kirtland Warbler's population can accept before they start trapping again? So again, it's that trade-offs of not as much money and less costly, but how much increased nesting parasitism are they willing to accept going into the future? One of the third strategy, if you remember, the recovery strategy was also the population monitoring. It had been decadal and it went to annual, and now it is not annual anymore. They are actually conducting it every other year. And there's a lot of talk about what this might be and the trade-offs of that. Would we be able to detect, or would we miss a decline that might happen? Or is every other year good enough? The other very pragmatic thing is, are we going to have a lost interest in our volunteers and our employees? And if we have that lost interest, then we're going to have to retrain a new cadre, so to speak, to conduct the monitoring, because there is a lot of people that go into this monitoring. And so those are some of the practical questions that the conservation team is struggling with, and also that they are putting into some of their monitoring plan, not only of the population, but the habitat. And so they continue to recognize these challenges and these risks to the 5 original recovery strategies, and they continue to plan for these and to refine that monitoring plan. And so just to fill you in on where that conservation plan is right now is the breeding population. They are targeting 1,300 males as the threshold of if it gets that low. They're going to start looking at the ways they're putting the habitat on the landscape, and they're going to look at that duration of use to revise their habitat regeneration targets. They are developing a decision tool to identify those thresholds that I was talking about, and so for now they're willing to accept a reduction in productivity, but if it's over 10% lost productivity over 5 years, that's going to be a trigger point. But they continue to discuss these, like I said. And then they continue to look at the habitat they created, the composition, the techniques, and the silvicultural techniques that they're using. And they're trying to do that in tandem with the jack pine market that are out there, and a lot of agency coordination there. And then last, to continue in research and other plans to really consider about the full life cycle. And so any threats that are happening in the winter grounds or during migration and forest health, and so they want to continue to look at this holistically. And I'm going to stop right there and open it up again to any questions that might be out there about what they're doing post-delisting. A lot of the Bahamian government is leading the conservation ethics or efforts, and they work a lot actually with the private landowners, specifically the goat farmers. If you remember earlier, goat farmers, the goats, maintain the habitats in that younger shrub preferred habitat. So they've got a lot of exciting conservation programs going on down there. So I think, Brian, maybe I've talked too long.
No, I don't believe it. I'm sure some people. Wait, here we go. Yeah, Bob just asked something in chat.
Yeah, Bob. You know, they did a genetic diversity some time ago. I don't remember how many years it was, and it was a very small sample, and they did not find any evidence of a bottleneck, and they felt it was quite diverse. But that's always a question I've asked, because the Kirtland warblers, you know, with them expanding their range, especially in that area in Wisconsin, they're finding a lot of nests, and they're finding a lot of those the fledglings that came from that area are returning to that area. And so I've always wondered with time, if they stay on the landscape, if you would have the core, and then you would start seeing maybe a little bit more diverse or a little bit different genetic associations as the population expands. But nobody's really looked at that yet. And we do have a lot of banding information that shows that they will move a lot from the core to the UP and then back again in one breeding season. So right now it seems okay. You know, I think they're both equally important. So I think with precipitation changes, the wintering grounds might lean a little bit more right now because of we know so much about the breeding habitat and how to regenerate that habitat, and they still have wildfires over there. But I am concerned that not enough effort is going to be done in the northern lower Michigan, or not enough, but you know, they're changing how they're doing the plantations, or creating the habitat. They're changing how they're monitoring, and we're changing a little bit on the cowbirds. So what's the cumulative effect of that? And I don't know that enough time has really passed on that yet. But the Bahamian island, I think, because there's not a lot of public lands there, and it is a lot more private, I think, depending on markets and goats, and that might have a tendency to lean a little heavy right now. But I know they're working so hard at doing cooperative efforts for conservation and working really hard with the goat farmers. I don't know if I really answered your question. Yeah, thank you, you guys. I could continue to talk about Kirtland. So if anybody has any follow-up questions or something, please give me a call or email me.
Thank you, Deanne. I appreciate. I'll clap. Normally you'd have a lot of clappers, but
thank you. I can put my email here. I probably should have done that.
Oh, in the chat?
On a slideshow, but
I suppose you're. I mean,
I'm always happy to talk about Kirtland warblers, and the efforts continue and research continues. So if anybody has any ideas or wants to get involved, please let me know. I'll make some connections, and we continue to look how they're responding to the habitats.
Well, thanks again for your time preparing your talk and spending a chunk of your Friday afternoon with us. I'm sure lots of people here appreciate it.
Great. I wish it could have been in person, but everybody, thanks again for showing up, and enjoy your weekend.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Let's see, I got to figure out how to get out of here.
You got 3 white bars at your upper left, and the upper left of your screen, if you click on those, you'll get a drop-down menu, and one of the options is to leave the session, but you can always just kill the browser tab or kill your Chrome.
I might have to, because I'm a little lost here. So I think I'm going to close, and thank you, Brian. I hope our paths cross again.
Yeah, thank you, Deanne. Have a good one.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Here we go.
Chrome refusing to
now
die.
I found it.